Well, welcome everyone to the final talk in our City and Security series, which is part of the City Talks series organized by the Urban Studies Committee at the University of Victoria. My name is Gordon Magnuson. I'm in the Political Science Department at UVic, and looking around for, well, Ruben Rose Redwood is the acting chair of our committee. We have one more talk coming up, and that's on Thursday, April 10th. That's actually a talk that was postponed from the fall. Valérie Améraud of the Department of Sociology at the University of Montreal on religious diversity and spatial justice. So if you missed the details of that, just go to our City Talks website. And that's part of our Religion in the Series, City series. We should be ready by then to announce what our fall program is going to be. We're still putting together the details of that and of our program in the spring. Today I'm very happy to have with us Adam Molnar, who is postdoctoral fellow at Queen's University in Kingston and is a recent PhD graduate of my department. Before that, we lured him away from the sociology department at UVic, knowing that political science is always a better place to study than sociology. But he's going off this summer to Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, where he has a new appointment. His field is surveillance studies. He's been part of a major research group in Canada of Colin Bennett of my department, who's in our audience tonight, is a major figure in that group. And part of the subject that Adam has been studying is security and surveillance in the context of major events like the Olympics or G8 events and so forth. And his talk today picks up on that. It's entitled, "In the Shadow of the Spectacle, Security Legacies in the Olympic City." Adam Molnar.
Thank you, Warren. And thank you for having me back out. It's always great to be in a place where I have spent several years kind of toiling away on research, and it's excellent to be sharing that work now with people who, in a public environment. We can present this work to academics routinely, but it's really quite a treat for me to be here in this kind of environment specifically. So thanks very much. Many of you will notice this photo. This is a photo of the geodesic dome at Science World in Vancouver, and above it you have a military helicopter. That's not photoshopped. That's an actual photo from a training exercise that was in the lead up to the 2010 Olympics. That involved the RCMP and the Department of National Defense and several other municipal police forces, including the Vancouver Police Department, in their own counterterrorism and emergency management training. It really kind of cuts to the core of what I want to talk about today, and that is specifically the ways in which security and policing exercises in the Olympic City are very, very massive logistical operations. They're some of the most unprecedented security and policing operations in Western liberal democratic cities today. And so just a brief outline, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to secure an Olympic city. How is it done? Who's involved? How extensive is it? How does it tie into a raft of other urban development projects? Second, I want to kind of trace a little bit about how the Olympics catalyze a range of security and policing operations that are unprecedented and are specific to major events or Olympic events themselves as a catalyst, but in many ways, after the 17-day event is over, they persist as legacies. And that's a lot of what my work has looked at, is what's left over after the event. I want to drill a little bit into some local context, and specifically to look at legacies from the Vancouver 2010 Games. Many of us probably know Vancouver quite well. We've either lived there or visited several times. So you might be interested to hear about what's left over in Vancouver 2010 and how we're kind of looking at the Vancouver Police Department specifically, and not only federal agencies, but Vancouver Police Department, as parts of it very, very transformed, that look altogether different. And finally, I want to focus a little bit on the more recent event, which was Sochi. Of course, many of us were probably following, at least whether you weren't following it or not, you were subject to the barrage of, is there going to be a security event in Sochi this year? You probably couldn't avoid it. And then when the game started, it completely went very quiet. But I want to look a little bit about what the Russian citizens and Russian security authorities are looking at as well as they move forward with their own set of legacies. Major events are now among the largest domestic operations ever undertaken within a country's borders. They're a catalyst for a range of urban development projects. In about the 1970s, it was recognized that there are areas within an Olympic city that could leverage public funds in a way that they could not have otherwise if they hosted an Olympic event. And that would be an opportunity to revamp the Olympic city. This actually ties into a lot of other threads, a lot of other strands around protecting the Olympic city. And so I want to tie in a little bit of the way that now the Olympics stand as some of the most significant areas where there's the expansion of military-type identification practices and ongoing surveillance of urban spaces. And that actually changes the way that police regulate urban space. It also changes the way that citizens encounter that space themselves. So when we talk about catalysts, what exactly are we talking about? Well, the Olympics actually present an exceptional moment. They're a one-off. In many ways, officials, authorities, whether you're an urban development planner or whether you're a police chief within a city, you're actually able to leverage a lot of political capital as a means to drive certain development projects. As I mentioned, urban regeneration, the Olympics are no longer about sport. By and large, they're about trying to rebrand the city, redevelop certain parts of the city in a way that will demonstrate the attractiveness of that city for inward investment on a global stage. So it's very much about brand marketing of that particular city and trying to bring in inward investment. And that's typically able to be done on the basis of an Olympic event. Officials are able to move and have access to public sources, to public funds, to fund real estate, to fund transport and development, to fund tourist projects in a way that they couldn't have otherwise. That being said, that brings significant responsibility, and there's a degree of reputation that's on the line. And in many ways, when security and policing officials come to this kind of event, or when people are hosting this event, it's in the context of significant uncertainty. It's the idea that nothing should go wrong during an event like this. And because of that, particularly after 9/11, there's been a very expansive threat horizon associated with an urban environment. And those two elements, when they get put together, you're looking at a very, very broad security response. So you're not just looking at policing in terms of beat enforcement and low-level crime enforcement. You're also looking at counterterrorism security. You're also looking at emergency response management. If an event happens, how are officials able to coordinate and respond to an event? And this has actually triggered the introduction of strong use of military forces in urban environments as a way to leverage a lot of these security responses. And so there's a certain degree of risk management that's going on in the urban environment. From event to event, there's a need to manage that uncertainty. And as global trends emerge from event to event, particularly since 1972 with an attack in Munich, there's been a demand to try and develop a security policy template that fits within a city. And that template can actually evolve and move throughout time. So when you're looking at the standardization of security in Olympic cities, this standardization actually gets built upon from event to event. So you have a sort of globalized mobile policy template about providing best practices in security at major events, but these best practices actually graft into localized scenarios. So in many ways, you're looking at the way that this standardized best practices fit within a local context, but they graft in and they take up a lot of the local circumstance. They take up a lot of the local nuance. And so it's often the local dynamics themselves that condition the way that the response takes shape. And so when you talk about protectionist reflex, I'm specifically talking about Ulrich Beck's concept that actually looks at the way that best practices and these mobile policy templates evolve and are recorrected over time, and they graft into these localized contexts. And I want to give you a little bit of a flavor, kind of an overview of how this has taken shape from significant events that have transpired in Olympic cities and how they have themselves conditioned security responses from 1972 up until the present day. So in Munich, in 1972, many of us will remember one of the first globally televised terrorist events to occur, known as the Munich massacre, where there was a hostage-taking scenario within the athletes' village specifically of Israeli athletes and coaches. A number of participants were killed, and this was one of the first events where international terrorism as a sort of exogenously designated threat, something that was outside of the local dynamic, came into Munich, and this event actually forced a lot of security planners to really stand up and take notice. There was significant fear and anxiety that flowed from this event moving forward. So much so that in 1976, one of the most overt security presences at any Olympics was actually the Montreal 1976 games. And in Montreal, it was very much a response to Munich 1972, where the key concern with hosting the games was security. And the response at this time focused on some preventative measures. Interestingly enough, it focused on having a very visible security presence within the Olympics, something that doesn't exist as much today for fear of inciting more fear. And of course, brand sponsors aren't very comfortable with the prospect of having an explicit security presence within the Olympic theater. And there was emphasis at 1976 on integrated surveillance responses. And this was one of the first games where a widespread integrated use of CCTV, of public video surveillance, was deployed. And there's a quote from the Montreal Olympics Organizing Committee that said, "It was agreed that the best way to deter suspected troublemakers was one that would leave no doubt in their minds that they were under continual close surveillance." So this is really at odds with German sensitivities about trying to have a very implicit and not very well recognized security and surveillance presence. So built into this response was to have a very visible security presence in the urban environment. But what's significant about Montreal is that it left a print on having a lasting electronic surveillance legacy. This moved forward to a different environment at Lake Placid in 1980, which was largely a rural area, and interestingly enough, was guarded much the way that a military base and an airport-style security would exist as. So it consisted of touch-sensitive fencing, the use of ground radar and night vision, also the use of CCTV. And together, they were actually very much about trying to provide perimeter intrusion detection. Interestingly enough, in Lake Placid, the athletes' village was converted into a correctional facility after the games were ended, in a kind of twist of irony. But here you have, at least in Lake Placid, the introduction of military-type response. So if Montreal was more about introducing CCTV and an integrated response in an urban environment, Lake Placid was also very much about securing perimeter and having the use of military-type tactic and strategy. I mentioned that a lot of the threats are locally defined. Seoul, here you have an image from a bombing of a KLA flight that killed 115 people in the lead up to the Seoul Olympics. And this was a threat that played out not in the same way that Munich 1972 did, as a sort of externally defined international terrorist event, but was something that was specific and local to where that city and country existed. So you see localized political dynamics play out often through the Olympics, whether that's through protest or more significant events like Seoul. Similar instance in Barcelona in 1972, there was a spate of separatist movements in Catalonia, a number of bombings within Brazil, a double pipeline bombing in Catalonia. And one of the reasons why I bring up Barcelona is because it was dubbed one of the first true urban regeneration games. There were aspects and areas within Barcelona that were slated for substantial development and funds that were able to be captured to redevelop Barcelona. But oftentimes this leads to significant externalities, whether that means gentrification, and either through renovation or displacement of urban populations. And in many regards, those populations become something to be regulated during the event itself. So in Barcelona, you actually had about 7,000 citations that were handed out in the urban environment to people that were considered homeless or street population. And this was a means to try and facilitate a more comfortable image, to attract inward investment, to demonstrate that Barcelona could be a city that can move to an entrepreneurial forum that could demonstrate its worth on a global stage. Now, in Atlanta 1996, protection in Munich 1972 was focused specifically on the athletes' village, was less so on the athletes' village. Montreal, specifically on the athletes' village. The perimeter ended at the athletes' village and the venues. There was not much security that was happening outside in the rest of the city. It was more or less an untouched zone. Atlanta changed that. There was a pipe bomb explosion in a park during the Atlanta Games, and it was in what is designated as a sort of soft area, an area that's not a hardened target like an athletes' village would have been up until that point. After this event, every urban area was considered a potential vulnerability. And that actually meant that security responses would spill out into the urban environment when an Olympic event would occur. So you see kind of an increase through the protectionist reflex of a widening of the spatial areas that get accommodated into security planning. And risk in that sense becomes unbounded. It actually moves into an unbounded spatial form. Sydney 2000 was quite interesting. One of the first introductions of the use of significant change to legislative policies and laws in the lead up to the Olympics, where you have the introduction of a Homebush Bay Act, which gave enhanced powers to military officials under the guise of counterterrorism response. But really the enhanced powers were to be able to conduct arrest on domestic soil in the event that there was any public disorder. These were laws that have actually stayed on the books since then and have existed as a persistent legacy. Between Sydney and Salt Lake, 9/11 happened. And you could imagine that this changed the way that the urban environment was considered during the Olympics. Interestingly enough, you now had the introduction, or at least the move towards preemptive policing and preemptive security. The idea that if you can forestall an attack, you can intervene in an attack beforehand, before the games, before an event, or before a terrorist attack occurs, and you can mitigate its effect by either stopping it completely or you can have an improved emergency management response, then you're conducting sufficient security policy. This came online with significant push through the FBI and the NSA through Salt Lake, and a move towards intelligence-led policing, which meant intercepting digital communication on a broad scale as a way to forestall or intervene in any potential attack. So now you have another ingredient within the protectionist reflex that looks into digital surveillance, that looks specifically into the partnerships between Quest and the NSA as a way to build backdoors into their intercept equipment. And that would be a way to monitor any email communication, any texting that was going on within Salt Lake, around the area, for approximately 6 months. There was some concern and some infighting about whether the capture of that data was on domestic American citizens or foreign targets. Nevertheless, you actually now see the Olympics is beginning to attract widespread signals intelligence operations. Athens, the first summer games to occur after 9/11, were all about integration. They were all about being able to harness a broad number of agencies through a significant emphasis on a technological solution. So you had SAIC and Siemens create a command control, communication, and integration center, sort of a nerve center to be able to integrate emergency response, police, gather intelligence from signals intel, and harness that all as a way to try and communicate it back out to officials within and across these different domains. There were significant use of CCTV, an overhead blimp, 24 hours, and it actually placed significant emphasis on technology at the expense of $1.6 billion. Unfortunately, the vendors, SAIC, Siemens, the integrated system failed to work in the lead up to the games, so it was completely dysfunctional. They actually had to rely back on traditional policing methods on the ground, and it demonstrated the stress and pressure that the Greek government was under to provide a safe and secure games. And there were some legal battles about this system failure and what that might mean for who's holding the tab that were just settled in court this past year, actually. The Greek government lost. Beijing in 2008 was the most expensive security operation in Olympic history, about $6.5 billion. And it was an opportunity for China to significantly extend and expand its surveillance systems, particularly CCTV, into approximately 600 cities through the Beijing safeguard sphere. In addition, Guangzhou, there were 2,000 camera network placed within a single neighborhood, and that was the first step into a citywide 250,000 camera network. So we could probably throw out Britain as one of the most heavily surveilled countries and societies, and introduce China as taking that crown. London 2012, at a cost of $1.5 billion, was very much about build design and grafting onto an already existing security and surveillance infrastructure. So you have the ring of steel that was created. It is a series of concentric circles, or the iron collar that used to protect against the possibility of bombings in the 1990s, a threat of bombings from the IRA. That was a series of access control points moving into the urban environment that were outfitted with automated license plate recognition and biometric recognition and CCTV that really emphasized design principles and building design principles into access control to regulate the potential for threat, to mitigate threat. So when we trace this kind of arc, we actually can see a range of new developments come online. On the one hand, we start in Munich, where you're looking at within the athletes' village, surveillance and security, an event that triggers a response in Montreal to look specifically within Olympic venues and the athletes' village. Moving after there, you have in 1996 specifically the pipe bombing in Atlanta. That moves the environment further out into the urban environment. And after that, you actually move into a change in legislative changes in Sydney, and also the introduction of signals intelligence in Salt Lake. Elsewhere in Athens, the integration of subsystems across a number of agencies and organizations, but then also the emphasis of building onto already existing urban environments. So when you understand the globalized mobile policy templates, they actually graft in and build onto what's already there. But these events, as I mentioned, are only 17 days. And you're moving from the idea that nothing should go wrong, and there's a significant degree of threat and uncertainty towards legacies that persist after the games. So what's interesting, and this is something that I've tried to take up more specifically in my work, is how legacy-related development, the notion of legacy as a discourse that gets tied into urban development projects as a way to justify return on investment through urban regeneration schemes, whether it's through relying on public funds for transport, whether it's trying to attract commercial interest through real estate or tourism. Legacy is a feature that's persistently in play. It's actually disproportionate to any discussion about security and surveillance legacies after the event is over. There's a real kind of muted discourse about security and surveillance when it comes to the question of legacies. And so when we look at official Olympic legacy discourse from the 1950s to the present, we can actually see that legacy first started as about bestowing sporting ideals for the population. As the IOC shifted focus in the 1970s, and the idea of having brand sponsors that actually saved the IOC from folding in the 1970s. They first came on just after that in the 1980s with the LA Games. There was the understanding that there were significant profits that could be made. There was a need to actually try and understand legacies as something that you could leverage urban development projects on. So you had this explosion of the use of legacy up until the point in 2004 where the IOC actually stitched it into their constitution. In fact, now in every bid book, for anyone who's trying to apply to host an Olympic event, they have to have significant portions of their bid to demonstrate the types of legacy that they'll be able to leave within that city. If we contrast that with the expansion of security initiatives since 1972, after 9/11, not a whole lot changed, but the budgets for security actually increased significantly. You have this explosion in security and policing at the games. And you also have the increasing use of legacy discourse as a means to justify Olympic-specific developments. You actually have an absence of looking at security legacies and surveillance legacies. Official IOC reports don't mention security and policing legacies at all. You might be able to catch Jacques Rogue or IOC security consultant talking about the positive elements of security legacies in the media, but by and large, that's a very, very rare occurrence. And media reports, when they take up the issue of legacy, is really kind of rhetorical. So it's difficult to actually try and dig in and look at what legacies exist in the Olympic city. So when we're talking about this range of security and surveillance developments at the Olympics, security legacies can in fact be many. They can be technological, they can be leftover material infrastructure from CCTV, the use of radio frequency identifying devices, signals intelligence infrastructure that gets developed for specific games purposes. They can be more about information sharing relations between a host of security, policing, and emergency management agents. It can also be about legal and legislative legacies. So when we're looking at changes in municipal bylaws to deal with vagrancies, to improve the kind of aesthetic of the Olympic city, or you might also be granting enhanced powers to military officials in Australia to conduct enforcement in a domestic environment that they might not have had otherwise. You're also looking at geographic legacies. So within the Olympic city, they are a lightning rod for protest and dissent. Oftentimes the disparity in public funding is a sensitive political issue. When communities see the amount of funds that go into Olympic projects that are slated for real estate and tourism, and they don't see this move into social services, it can trigger a lot of protest. That actually becomes an issue for police to control during the event itself. So public order and the spatial control of the city is a significant transformation, as I'll get into when I talk about Vancouver 2010. And that relies on an understanding of the city as something that can be splintered and divided up into different spaces. Culturally, legacies also persist. The Olympics, as this sort of one-off event, bestow a kind of understanding that there's an exceptional circumstance and that most people who want to attend the games will give up a certain degree of their understanding of their rights, or an understanding of feeling the need to be in an environment that's considered safe. And because of that, there's a sort of normative redrawing of the boundaries within the city around those particular issues. So there's a general degree towards the acceptance of these kinds of transformations to occur, even if individuals might not agree with how they're used later. And so this brings us to Vancouver, which is something I've spent a lot of my time working on in the past 4 or 5 years. And here you have a beautiful picture of the North Shore. The Vancouver 2010 Olympic security operation was the largest domestic security operation in Canadian history, followed by I think it was usurped actually by the G8, not very long after that, within the same year. But when I'm talking about that mobility of the standardized best practices from event to event, you can actually recognize that within the Canadian context itself. The RCMP was the head of Olympic security, and they built a policy template from the ground up about how to manage much of the urban environment. They were responsible for all the Olympic venues, all the events they had control over. Everything that fell outside of Olympic venues was under the jurisdiction of the VPD. You see a very, very similar template get picked up and moved into the G8, where all of the events associated with the political summit were under the auspices of the RCMP. Everything else was the Toronto Police Services. But what's significant about this event is that it drew police from across the country. Nearly every municipal police force in every major city sent officials to join in the security and policing response. And that actually was really quite interesting for looking at that integration. It was interesting for looking at the various ways that the Vancouver 2010 Games were as much about a seed about knowledge and information that would spread out across the rest of the country. So there was this mobility that takes place just within the authorities and the officials themselves. In Vancouver, the price tag was $1 billion. It was revised upwards on several occasions. It originally started at $250 million in the bid book. That's very common. But it brought together the RCMP, CSIS, the Department of National Defense, the Vancouver Police Department, a number of officials from a broad range of municipal organizations, as I mentioned, and the significant use of private security. And so I spent time looking at a few different case studies. Specifically, I wanted to try and dig into the public video surveillance legacies in Vancouver. What were the policies leading up to 2010? How many cameras were bought? Where were they put? Were policies redrawn? After the 17 days were over, what infrastructure stayed? Were there any changes in the policies that affect the use of these technologies moving forward? Second, I looked at public order policing. And this was also questions to look at the ways that standardized best practices actually were significantly conditioned, at least in 1999 from the WTO protests, and then actually moved forward and into Vancouver. And we wanted to try and really dig into the ways that the Vancouver Police Department was trying to manage and negotiate protests within the urban environment. And finally, I also wanted to look at civilian-military integration, which is a significant trend in security and policing operations at major events. So when we're looking at public video surveillance in the Olympic City, as I mentioned, standardized best practices graft into localized context. We were really thinking that based on the political history of CCTV in Vancouver, that there would be a few neighborhoods that would be slated for significant enhancement in CCTV surveillance. The downtown east side was an area that there was proposals by the Vancouver Police Board to introduce CCTV in the downtown east side that was fought back in 1996. But also the Granville Entertainment District had faced significant calls because of low-level unruliness and fights that were happening. The Vancouver Police wanted to have CCTV in those particular areas. And so on the basis of $2.5 million in provincial and federal funding to bolster the CCTV program in Vancouver, these areas, it was thought, would actually see the most action when it came to CCTV. It didn't actually work out that way. For whatever reason, the VPD was not so much interested in following up on the earlier interest, which is really quite an interesting finding. Nevertheless, there were 84 citywide cameras that were introduced at key intersections within Vancouver. And they were under the jurisdiction of the Vancouver Police Department. Now, I mentioned earlier that all the Olympic venues were under the jurisdiction of the RCMP. They had 900 cameras within all of the Olympic venues. Those cameras are actually on contract from Honeywell. They were rented for the duration of the games, and they were subsequently mothballed. So all of those 900 cameras actually came down at the end of the event. The 84 cameras stayed. There were a number of other cameras, 16 or in the area of 16 to 20 cameras that are considered temporary redeployable cameras. And this is a sort of a more recent development in CCTV at major events where cameras can be put up for temporary periods during the time of the event and then taken down. Public officials are able to justify the use of the technology on that basis, that during the time of the event, limited frame, we can take them back down. Now, there was a previous policy in Vancouver with the 84 cameras where data would be captured and recorded and stored for a temporary period. And that conditioned a lot of training in the operations and control room with the Office of Emergency Management. After the event was over, the 16 temporary cameras stayed up. They persisted. Many of them were switched off. They were deactivated. When subsequent events would occur, like the Grey Cup or the Celebration of Lights, the cameras come back on. And you have people who were responsible in the control room operating these cameras. The justification to actually have these cameras is that they're at a higher aerial location. So they're considered to be public safety cameras and not surveillance cameras. They're not in low-lying urban areas. They're not recording people's faces directly, but they're more about directing the flow of traffic, of trying to see if someone is having a cardiac arrest and you can send emergency response there. And that actually conditions the definition of the cameras as public safety tool and not a surveillance tool. VPD was actually able to redraw their policy to understand, the city was actually able to redraw their policy to understand this technology as not about surveillance. They didn't actually have to apply for privacy impact assessments to use the technology. Nevertheless, ethnography of control room operators who were using these cameras were in fact using them for targeted surveillance. And so you see this real and directing police towards groups of who have been identified as gangbangers. So you're seeing actually the use of this technology being defined as through a policy veneer. On the one hand, as being something that is very much about situational awareness, and yet they're actually being used as something that is about targeted surveillance. So the legacy is, in this case, quite interesting. It's less about going around and counting the cameras and what goes up and what comes down, but there's a redrawing of the CCTV policy in Vancouver that would condition the use of the technology as a public safety technology, one that was about surveillance, could be justified by the physical location of the cameras within the city. They were aerially situated, and that actually would mean a public, a sort of public veneer about how the technology is being used, which is at odds with the way that it's actually being used. So the legacy is very much about the relation between redrawing the policy and the operational use of the technology. Now, the question of situational awareness, this is a concept that came up in Vancouver city documents. And it's very much about being able to provide a view of the urban environment. It's a military term. And the concept is used in public safety just to improve the direction of traffic, to improve public safety response. But what's interesting is that that concept has actually been expanded in Vancouver now to include the potential for disruption to economic activities and or damage to the physical environment of the city. So it's a concept that's now being used to regulate public order, which is very much tied into surveillance questions. So you see this creep happening not so much in the material infrastructure, but in the definitional parameters, which is much more subtle, but over the longer term can give emergence to a new set of practices. I did interviews with the Vancouver Police Department about public order policing. And one of the things that they told me is that the crowd management unit, from when it used to exist in the 1970s, had changed from the top to the bottom in Vancouver. I was told that it looked nothing like it used to. In the 1970s, it was primarily about a reactive response. You mobilize a squad of about 80 individuals to a particular protest or event that's occurring. And now it fits in with the preemptive response after 9/11. The idea of intervening and forestalling the prospect for violent action or for physical property damage. I was told that you no longer need to know how to swing a stick. And this is quite interesting because the VPD demonstrated a new tactic in their public order campaign. It was very much about soft control. They had individuals that were placed in the context of the crowd in highly visible vests. And they were a part of the celebration by and large. There were many of them. They were smiling and engaging with people who were there to celebrate the Olympics. And that was a tactic that they were really quite interested and proud of as a way to try and engage in a form of sort of soft psychological control to mitigate the prospect for any untoward event. If the police could be seen as a peer in that kind of environment, well then that would actually forestall or stem the prospect of any event. This actually came along with a new development towards quick response teams. So there was a development where groups of 8 officers could be pared down into smaller groups that would be able to respond, be rapidly deployed and respond to any event that would occur within the city. And that actually demonstrated a shift from that kind of reactive unit that would be called up to stem off a large-scale protest, and instead you had very, very small units that could be dispatched to problem areas several units dispatched to problem areas across the city, which changes the sort of the reach and the temporality of the way that the city can be governed through public order. But these sort of elements of spatial control and the legacies that persist from them, and especially when you talk about public order, is not specifically to do with the urban environment in that sense, the spatial environment. It's also very much to do with gathering intelligence before an event occurs, also during an event, but then also after an event. So the intelligence collection phase occurs not just at the games, not just at the event. We have to think that this is something that is significantly unbounded. And the RCMP, through CSIS and specifically through the Integrated Threat Assessment Center, introduced a new threat designation called multi-issue extremism that came up specifically at the 2010 Olympics. This was unprecedented within Canada. It was a new term. And specifically, it was about trying to deal with what CSIS called domestic extremism. And it was a mutation in the environment, in terms of the threat environment. In many respects, it grafted on very, very neatly with groups and populations that spanned Indigenous and First Nations groups, to environmental groups, to poverty activists, many people who were dissatisfied with having the Olympics and the sort of accelerated development projects within Vancouver. And in the absence of any threat by Al-Qaeda, in the absence of an exogenous defined threat coming into Vancouver, no actionable intelligence on that front meant that there was a redirection of a lot of the security and intelligence apparatus down into this concept of multi-issue extremism. And that grafted very neatly onto a number of activist populations. Many people experienced that firsthand. They'll share stories about infiltration and police visiting their work. But what's really quite interesting with this is that the use of intelligence actually wasn't just about the categorical mutation, but it was also about expanding the realm of agencies that are involved with collecting intelligence. So you have not just the categorical shift, but a broader number of partners that are implicated. So the integrated response, specifically the Integrated Threat Assessment Center, it's now called the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center, drew on a large number of organizations. Not just security-specific organizations, but they had a large number of individuals that were seconded into the Integrated Threat Assessment Center from transport agencies, from Health Canada, agencies that were not traditionally associated with the criminal justice system. That move actually gave an opportunity to then create a associational network into the databases of these specific organizations. So it expanded the realm, or at least the distribution and access to certain kinds of information that could be brought into the frame. And the final case I want to touch on is with civilian military integration in Vancouver. Here you have the crest of the Vancouver Police Department's Military Liaison Unit. It's the first unit of its kind in Canada at a municipal level. It was introduced by one particular officer in 2001. This officer went to his chief at that time and said, based on his own military background, and said, we have no policy around negotiations or collaborating with the military. I would like to set something up in this regard. The chief authorized that. He came back with a policy, which was accepted. It was kind of on the books. It kicked around until 2003, when the Games were awarded to Vancouver, and it was identified that the Olympics would indeed be in Vancouver in 2010. And that actually meant the solidification of the military liaison unit in Vancouver. It grew to be a 28-person member unit, and the key purpose was to provide an institutional nexus between Vancouver and military agencies to facilitate communication during the Olympics. Traditionally, the military and the police operate under different nomenclature, and the purpose of this unit is to really facilitate any kinds of partnerships that would be happening within the urban environment. But we're talking specifically about in the event of an earthquake and Vancouver is piled under a foot of glass. Well, they really wanted to have something in place that would allow the police to conduct operations with the military, conduct emergency response. During the training phase of the Olympics, and after that, relations were formed between the Canadian Forces and the Vancouver Police Military Liaison Unit, to such an extent that now we see joint training exercises between the Canadian Forces, the Vancouver Police Department, and with cross-border partners in the United States. At the moment, the Vancouver Police Department's Military Liaison Unit is doing training exercises in Fort Lewis and Yakima, Washington, about 4 to 6 times a year. This is something that was really formed during the lead up to the Games. These relationships were formed during the lead up to the Games, and it's something that's persisted after that. Now you see the Military Liaison Unit and Canadian Forces partnering with the Department of Defense, the U.S. Army, the Washington National Guard, the Marine Corps Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and subsequently what you see is Canadian Forces pairing up with their own local battalions in Vancouver. In Victoria, there was a proposal to introduce a Military Liaison Unit, which was a policy that spun out of the Vancouver Liaison Unit. That was discussed. Victoria did actually go down on a couple of training operations. They've subsequently shelved the Military Liaison Unit here for now, it looks like. But then also Calgary Police Services have their own Military Liaison Unit where they partnered with their own Canadian Forces battalion. And all these groups go down and train 4 to 6 times a year. And the training actually exceeds the mandate of emergency management. So we're looking at a broad field for collaboration. Specifically, they're looking at shifts in use of force. The military recognizes that they can no longer enter into a scenario with the pointing end of the stick, and they actually need to draw on police-style intelligence gathering and the police use of force continuum in many of their overseas operations. So what's really quite interesting is that you're not looking at specifically at the militarization of policing. You're not looking at police taking on urban tactical developments that have been fashioned in the context of the 3-block war in places like Jalalabad or in the Sudan. You're actually looking at the inversion as well. You're actually looking at the military really trying to learn from how policing is done in urban environments. And that's something that, again, circulates, is mobile, and circulates into hotspots where you see Western military forces operating in military-type environments. So the legacies to come out of the civilian-military integration in the context of Vancouver are very much about integration. They're very much about the militarization of police. In some respects, what's quite interesting is that in the lead up to 2010, there was a need to expand the military liaison unit. So that meant that the unit was used as recruitment. It actually hired a large number, 13 to be exact, officials who had, quote, previous battleground experience that they could bring in to serve in the military liaison unit. But what's interesting is that these officials also serve as frontline cops. They're actually beat enforcement officers first, and they get seconded to the military liaison unit. So you now have the hiring of a different kind of subjectivity into the urban policing environment. That's not to say that there's not significant training in the police use of force continuum when it comes to working on the job, but it does actually point to the way that this kind of unit introduces a kind of militarization by its use as a valuable recruitment tool, by forming partnerships that are by and large informal as a means to introduce new officers. And that gets into the way that many of these relationships are formed on personal grounds as much as they are on professional grounds. Whether it was integration in public order and officers moving back into their municipal environment and saying, hey, we can do this differently. We can engage in rapid deployment teams like we saw in Vancouver, in Montreal for student protests, which there is some information sharing going on there, couldn't have existed without that kind of personal exposure, without actually knowing the officers or the other officials that you work with. And at that point, really being able to pick up the phone and call in a favor or call someone up. But these questions and the legacies speak to the way that jurisdictional questions come into play. So one of the key opportunities for the US Army to have the Vancouver Military Liaison Unit down into the US was to circumvent posse comitatus in the United States, which upholds a distinction between police and military partnerships. The Washington National Guard could insist that they're not getting training from local police, and they could really draw on the experience of Vancouver. In return, the Vancouver Police Department was able to train outside of Canadian jurisdiction with the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, which they would not actually have to go to Transport Canada to apply for their own certification, their own authorization. And yet they can develop this technological expertise. This is an image actually from Ariane from a UAV in a training operation that involved the Vancouver Police Department and the Calgary Police Services, along with their US counterparts. And it's posted on Ariane's website as a way to try and demonstrate the way that their UAVs or their drones are being used. And so what this actually introduces is a kind of opportunity for the knowledge and expertise of the technology to be introduced back into a Canadian context. So you can develop the skills and expertise outside of the city in a training type scenario, but it has the potential to really condition the way that UAVs and drones are going to be used in the city moving forward. So we're looking at a kind of dislocation, a spatial dislocation that then, again, is brought back home as a mobile policy into the urban environment. So what's at stake when we're talking about security in Olympic cities? One, we're talking about the expansion, significant expansion of security and policing assemblages, whether that's in the area of signals intelligence, whether it's the spatial dislocation into an untamed urban environment from the athletes' village, expanding as far out as possible, typically only limited by budgets. Imagination stretches further than budgets, even at $1 billion. And you're also looking at the redevelopment of public order policing and counterterrorism operations. You're looking at the change in low-level policing at the same time as a way to try and to enhance the brand image of the city, furnish the reputation of the Olympic city, and deal with the externalities of gentrification or the externalities of protest and response to Olympic-specific policies. There's a demand placed on regulating low-level incivilities. And so this is something that is a persistent feature in the Olympic city. What else is important is that the Olympics are primary justification for integration. You see integration across a range of agencies that does not historically exist if it were not for hosting an Olympic Games. Whether that's at the level of information sharing, in skills and expertise, whether it's developing informal networks across civilian and military relations, or whether it's tying in specifically into a database architecture, it actually spans a range of practices. And that integration is something that persists. It's a demonstrable legacy of hosting an Olympic event. And again, you see the ongoing globalization of standardized best practices. Typically, there are conferences after events like this. Break down after action reports, what worked, what didn't. I know, for instance, that Vancouver and Montreal with the student protest were very much in conversation with about how Montreal could improve, or the other way around, how Vancouver could improve on what Montreal is doing. So you're looking at the sort of spatial dislocation out of the Olympic city itself, but into other environments. And this is something that doesn't actually end within the Olympic cities themselves. It's unbounded. And finally, the Olympic event actually sustains a disproportionate level of fear and anxiety regarding urban-specific security vulnerabilities. Typically, when we look at security and policing, or the threat of terrorism, the actual instance of terrorism within an urban environment, it's really quite low in other cities. And so what I've become quite interested in, not least because of the news cycle with Sochi, which was really interesting, is how people come to encounter their own urban environment after that kind of disproportionate representation. And what it means for security planners who then draw on the expertise of officials who work in Olympic cities, but bring that back to their own environment as though it's a persistent and ever-present threat, and implement subsequent policy changes. So there's a degree at which subjectivities are formed through that integration that I'm quite interested in as a way that the mobility of subjectivities and not just policies or standardized templates can lead to a disproportionality, or developing policies when really you're looking at an event that is quite rare. And so when we're looking at Sochi, it was really quite an interesting event. It was actually, interestingly, about 2 times the size of a security operation than London 2012 was. And yet Sochi is 20 times smaller. So you can imagine the scale and the intensity at which the security operation in Russia was at that time, but also speaks to the way that it wasn't just Sochi that was the subject of security operations. The security threat was unbounded in Russia significantly. It was in protections in Moscow and St. Petersburg, also because of the bombing in Volgograd just about 6 weeks prior to that. And so this was with the onset of 24-hour use of UAVs around the clock, significant, again, like you saw at Salt Lake, use of signals intelligence through a Russian project called SORM that would intercept digital communications and monitor them persistently. But what was interesting, and I think the most interesting for me, were some of the legislative changes that happened in Sochi in the lead up to the Olympics there. What happened during that time was, because of the threat within the North Caucasus region, the Russian authorities passed laws that said if you're a family member or a close relative of an official, of someone who could be engaging or profiting from terrorist activity, then you can be forced to pay for damages stemming from that event. And so this was a new law that actually grants enhanced powers to the FSB and also the Caucasus police as a means, interestingly enough, as a legacy there, if it's being used in the way that previous laws that have existed in that way, to extract bribes from local communities. There's relatively no oversight in how these laws have been passed, and have been similar laws in Dagestan and anti-Wahhabist laws that have done the same thing, in many respects actually flame the insurgency in that environment. There was another law that was passed that would actually double the sentences for anyone that was engaging in terrorist activity, engaging in training terrorist activity. That's a very, very broad definition about training. It could inculcate journalists and human rights groups who want to do interviews within a specific area. And it's also another law that can lead to significant abuse without proper oversight. So I'm happy to answer questions about Sochi. I did have something in here about Brazil, which is going to be very, very interesting. Again, a very different dynamic. Brazil is not Sochi, it's not London, and you're looking at a very different scenario. Some standardized templates, you do see a lot of catalyst and a move towards the emphasis on military-type tactics, but again, very different from Vancouver and the way that's actually taking shape here. So these are questions that I would be happy to answer in the question period, and I'll leave it there. If otherwise you would like to contact me, there's my information. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. I think the easiest thing is just to direct your questions straight to Adam, and there's a microphone.
Hey, so Brazil is an entire country. World Cup is in many cities. Do you have an eyes to understanding how Brazil is going to play out as far as security and surveillance?
What you're seeing right now is the UPP, which is a sort of a domestic military type service, and they actually have moved into many areas that are around Olympic specific developments. I wish I still had this map, I would totally throw it up. And there have been a lot of forced evictions in these areas, and they've taken over control of many of these neighborhoods and displaced a lot of population who are in illicit drug trade and in arms trade, but they've moved them into more peripheral areas. And so they have, to a greater or lesser extent, a kind of control over this environment that they hope to maintain over the Olympic period. This is something that poses a problem after the games are over, because they then become in a position of dependence. And how that actually plays out is going to be an open question, but it does present, I think...
I apologize, I kind of went into the World Cup there rather than...
Yeah, no, I mean, they're 2 years apart. So they're actually going to roll, again, a lot of the policy templates that they're engaging with right now into both events. So it's entirely legitimate.
Question.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions that deal with the issue of legacy, specifically in the context of Vancouver or Victoria. Because I see it as a kind of a two-edged sword, the integration piece. Certainly as someone who lives in a major earthquake zone, I kind of like the idea that the police and the military are coordinated, so when the big one comes, they can actually talk to each other. That'd be nice.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that as kind of a good thing. I'm wondering what the downside of it is. And the second thing relates to that. You talked about the fact that the Vancouver Police Department goes down to the US and gets trained and so on. But you also commented that it was both professional and personal. And I'm wondering to what extent those personal links that were there in the Olympics start to fade away as people move on. And so whether the legacy is a rather short-lived legacy to the extent it's based on those personal links, or is it really strongly institutionalized?
With regards to the first, I think you're quite right. Most people would not actually have a problem with being able to marshal the resources of the military in an urban environment, whether it means having generators or other resources to respond to, in terms of safety and trying to find survivors, facilitate disaster response and disaster recovery. What's quite interesting about this, though, is that this field of collaboration is really quite expansive. It's very broad. It doesn't just stop at emergency management and disaster response. It deals with urban tactical operations, door-kicking exercises. You're dealing with basically exercises that revolve around the three-block war. The idea that you have an urban front, a sort of second response that's dealing with first aid, and third around development. The issue here is that the military liaison unit in Vancouver has actually not had any sort of public consultation with the citizens of Vancouver, and it's something that has evolved more or less organically out of training and the fact that the military liaison unit was able to be institutionalized in the lead up to the Olympics and furnish a reputation that they were able to grow and develop through and really tie into a host of other relationships. So there's this indirect effect that comes out in a legacy sense. But the concern is that there's much more that's happening than the emergency management type response. There's relatively no oversight at the moment about over this kind of unit and what it looks like. And there's some concern about that, particularly when we have laws in Canada that regulate how our police are using certain technologies that they're able to circumvent, and what that might mean for the reintroduction of those expertise in a domestic environment. So that's a conversation to be had, certainly. And I think there needs to be some discussion about where normatively appropriate boundaries are on the kinds of operations that are happening. And second, the personal versus professional. This is interesting because really it's the personal relationships that are able to facilitate the institutionalization. It's the soft networks that come into play first, and then on that basis, you're able to start to formalize and routinize training regimes or specific schedules. But I love that you brought up the fact that this is not a sort of persistent legacy effect. It's not something that because it's institutionalized once, it exists that way forever. I think, in fact, these are often kind of breaking down and being reformed in new ways, and it's process-oriented in that sense. And I think that's the way that when you look specifically at the military liaison unit, it took its form in a very indirect way. I asked what kind of resources they were able to get from hosting the Olympics, and I was told, you name it. And it wouldn't have, if not for the resources that the MLU was able to have and institutionalize themselves and furnish a reputation, they wouldn't have been able to really act on a lot of the relationships that they've subsequently been able to form through personal networks and otherwise. And that's not to say that's going to persist. For instance, you look at Victoria, they sent people down, tried to set up, originally had authorization from the chief to set up a military liaison unit here in Victoria, and did send people down. There was a business case that was on the books. And that's something that just fizzled, I think. And so this is by no means a kind of direct process, and these legacies are by no means set in stone, and that institutionalization process is much about tracing its trajectory than it is saying that this is a concrete, persistent legacy at every event.
I'm sorry, just by way of follow-up, the oversight, presumably the military liaison unit, the oversight is the police board, and therefore the mayor and so on.
Correct. Yeah. There's more or less information that you can put in a budget request to the police board. And so I think the scale and extent to which the kinds of training operations that are occurring in Yakima are perhaps probably not all entirely included in those discussions. There's some other concern about the extent to which the police board is, the structural way that the police board is set up in relation to police in British Columbia specifically, that could feed into some of these issues as well.
18 months at the Olympics, Vancouver suffered a major riot after a hockey game. And the police department's response was widely seen as totally inadequate. What happened to their crowd control measures? How did they react so inadequately?
That's interesting. The Olympics were considered very successful in terms of a public order policing operation. I've heard two interesting stories from both within Vancouver police. On the one hand, they'll say this was a very successful operation for the Olympics. We kind of thought that that was going to continue when we moved into the Stanley Cup playoffs. We realized that the mood was a little bit different than the Olympics. Things started to change a bit as you got into the second and third round of the playoffs. They claimed that they went to the city and said we need more resources, and they didn't get those resources from the city, so they'll try and shift it onto the city. On the other hand, I've heard them say that we thought we were doing really great at the Olympics, and we kind of just walked through it. We thought that was going to be the same scenario. So there's two things happening there. There was a review that came out after the Stanley Cup riots. There were a number of issues that were identified, and when you get into the issue of integration, again, you look at the way that it's not traditionally security-specific organizations that get brought into a public order response. You had the VPD Public Order Unit reach out to the Liquor Control Board and stop selling, and ask them to stop selling alcohol on Game 3 of one of the events, or Game 6, before the final game. That was a tactic that they had also used at the Olympics, and they found it very effective. When they did that in Game 6, thinking it might be the last game, Vancouver could win, we want to be able to make sure that there's not a lot of alcohol in the streets. The Liquor Control Board consented. There was a forced Game 7. That brought it back into Vancouver. They tried the same tactic again. The cat was out of the bag that they did it on Game 6, and I think basically people just either got all their booze outside of Vancouver or stocked up on what they had at home, and that was a tactic that complete and utterly failed for them. And so, I think what's more interesting about that is that it speaks to the way that regulation and control is moving out into a larger number of agencies and organizations, and these relations are being formed. So, yeah.
Thanks, Adam. That was fascinating. I have all kinds of questions. But I was just really curious about how you negotiated access and your research methodology. Was it difficult to do your interviews? And did you do sort of an ethnographic analysis as well? I was just wondering if you could talk about your kind of approach to the study.
Yeah. I was actually directed to a contact within the VPD. And that was through an acquaintance, and I have to say that the Vancouver Police Department was absolutely excellent. I was able to sit down with them on several occasions and conduct interview, follow-ups, questions through email. They really were fantastic, and so it was quite interesting. I think since then it's been quite interesting when you're negotiating your findings. And communicating your findings, and you have these relationships that you form through the interview process and a rapport that you've developed. It's an interesting position to be in, but I found Vancouver to be excellent. The RCMP, on the other hand, were not very helpful. At my requests, I did have some email exchange But in that sense, I really had to rely on access to information requests, and I found that to be a really effective way to fill out a lot of the records that I couldn't actually have through interview with the RCMP.
You did a great job of illustrating how from one game to the next builds and takes kind of what they've learned from the previous times and so on. And that's kind of over 40 years now. You've been looking at stuff 30 and 40 years ago from some of the places like Montreal and Lake Placid and so on. Quite a ways removed from us now. What is the legacy still in existence there? Have things kind of tapered off? What have we got to look forward to 10 and 20 and 30 years from now compared to how it was in Vancouver and here in Victoria?
That's a difficult question. I know at least that Montreal just paid their bill off. Last year, I think? That close. It becomes a difficult empirical historical question about really at what point do you say this is kind of causation is kind of coming from another area, and it's, really what I've tried to look at is the consolidation and the institutionalization of specific units to either emerge on the scene, if it weren't for the games otherwise, to say this would not have existed if Vancouver didn't host the Olympics. And that's something that you can go and follow it. And I think that's important. The emergence of a military liaison unit in Victoria, whatever its status now, I don't know, but that would not have existed if it weren't for 2010. So this becomes a difficult question, but I mean, I think you can say at least 10 years from now that the military liaison unit will quite likely still be operative. Maybe by then there will be more of a discussion about the way that civilian military partnerships are happening in Canada. Even though we don't have similar laws like in the US with posse comitatus, there's lots of ways in the US to circumvent that and other ways for militarization to unfold. But I mean, it could also incite a lot of other possibilities, and particularly how we deal with public disclosure in these kinds of areas. So hopefully legacies aren't just one way in one direction, but this is an opportunity to introduce a new kind of discussion.
I'm claiming the last question. I'm wondering, following on Vincent's question about the Stanley Cup riots, I'm just wondering how these security people conceive of the business in which they're engaged. I mean, I can imagine people thinking, well, Stanley Cup and Grey Cup, and that's a different kind of thing altogether. Olympics is about defending against terrorism and so forth, whereas Stanley Cup, that's just drunken kids from the suburbs. And,
Right.
And these are two different businesses, and so we're not. I can imagine people thinking of themselves as specialists in one or the other. Do you have can you tell me or us a little bit more about the kind of culture that you noticed amongst the people you interviewed, how they understood themselves?
Yeah, I mean that's difficult because there is counterterrorism specific responses within the Vancouver Police Department where I did most of my interviews. Those intelligence reports, specifically in counterterrorism, come through Ottawa. They come through the Integrated Threat Assessment Center, and they're sent out on a daily basis. They do the risk assessment and the analysis. They get dispatched to municipal police forces across Canada. So the terms are by and large set in terms of what the threat designation is going to be, which is quite interesting because when you have something like multi-issue extremism, domestic extremism, the threat of violence within the city, for instance, and the pliability of that term to get then taken up at a municipal level, there's incredible range to understand that within a different sensibility when it becomes an actionable operational protocol. I didn't actually, there's that kind of cultural element, the idea that this is agencies that are in a different environment that are drawing on similar terms in very different ways. You could make the case that CSIS has their thumb on a particular strand that they're interested in, whereas an officer in the VPD was going to look at it in an entirely different way. That's an interesting translation. On the other hand, when you look at the distinction between something like international terrorism or, drunk teenagers from the suburbs with the threat of violence from one or the other, I don't think that, I didn't see that come up in the interviews, but I didn't also actually see it come up in how tactical responses would unfold. So, for instance, once you set up a public order response, you have your rapid response team there. They're going to be quickly deployed for the possibility that there might be violence at a protest. That kind of protocol, that operation is going to be the same as it would for another group because it's what's in place and it's what's tactically available or available as a policy option. It's interesting in the absence of any kind of actionable threat of international terrorism, everything kind of then becomes the same. There is this kind of leveling process that when you swing a hammer really well, everything looks like a nail. So this is kind of an interesting play, and it really speaks to the mutability of specific tactics across populations as a legacy, and the prospects for mission creep to unfold.
Thanks very much, and thanks to every one of you for joining us again. And let me just remind you that we'll be assembling on the 10th of April, and our speaker is Valerie Amonwo from Montreal. Hope you can join us then. Thanks again.
Thank you.